Hello again, it's Baselight Bob here with another free session on Baselight Essentials. If you're enjoying these sessions and have any comments or requests, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us via the form on our website, that's in the training section of our website, or you can send an email to student@filmlight.ltd.uk. Okay, today I'm going to cover adding grades. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat and we'll try and answer them during the session. Okay, I'll just share my screen and then we can get started. Now that we have a timeline with some footage, I'm going to show you how to add grades and other effects to your shots. But before I do that, let me give you a quick overview of the timeline. Firstly, each of these objects in the timeline is known as a strip. Strips can represent different things such as grading operators, transforms, filters, and so on. In this case, all the strips that we have here are sequence strips. In other words, they represent the input image sequence for each shot. When you select a strip, its settings or parameters appear in this part of the user interface. We call this the parameters view. If you want to remind yourself about the different areas of the user interface, then you can watch the first video in this series. So when I start to add grades, you will see that additional strips are added here in the timeline. So to move from one shot to the next, you can use the X and the Z buttons on the keyboard, and these will jump the cursor to the first frame of each shot. If you want to move by single frames, you can use the right and the left arrow keys on the keyboard, and pressing the space bar will toggle playback and stop. And you can also drag the cursor using this big blue handle at the top here. We'll be covering the timeline more fully in another session later on, but here's a quick summary of the relevant keyboard shortcuts. If you've got a control panel, then of course you can use the buttons on that to control playback and navigate the timeline too. Okay, so let's add some grades to these shots. I'm going to start with this shot here. And you'll notice that I didn't actually have to select the strip. The strips are selected automatically in the timeline as the cursor moves across them. So to add a grade, you start by pressing P on the keyboard. Or if you've got a control panel, you can press the Add Layer button. And you'll see that a new grading layer has now been added to the timeline. And grading strips are always green by default. But you can change the color if you want to by clicking on this button at the top here and then choosing a different color in the color panel. And this is quite handy if you want to color code all the strips in your timeline. You don't have to do that, but it can help remind you where certain things are in the timeline. Okay, the new strip that I added is automatically selected, so its controls appear in the parameters view up here. So let me just explain a little bit about what we have here. On the left, obviously, are the grading controls themselves, and to the right of those, we have a list of what we call operators. Now, if your system hasn't been customized, if you don't have any grade preferences, then you will see this same list of operators that I have here, with the top one, which is the base grade, selected by default. If you have some customizations to your grades, then you may see a different list, but we'll be covering customizations in another session. So the controls that we have on the left relate to the operator that we have selected in this list. So if I click on the film grade, you'll see we have a different set of controls: video grade, curve grade, and so on. So I'll just summarize that. The parameters that are shown here depend on the strip that you've selected in the timeline. And if you've selected a grading strip, then the grading controls are shown for the currently selected operator. So if I select the top strip, which remember is the image sequence strip, we see the parameters for this particular input image sequence. And we'll have a look at a few of these a bit later on. Okay, so back to the grading layer. Now you may have noticed when I added the grade layer that it was added below the sequence strip rather than above. In most other timeline-based systems, filters and other effects are added on top in the timeline, whereas in Baselight they're added below. It's just one of those things that makes Baselight a bit different from other systems. We always start at the top and then work our way downwards. Now, as I've just added this, all the controls are in their default or neutral state, so they're not having any effect on the image. And you can tell that because all of the operator names are white. If I adjust one of these controls, you'll see that the name is now blue. And if you're working on a slate or a blackboard control panel, you'll see that the grading operator button on the panel has also gone blue. So remember that you can reset any of these controls by pressing on the little R button here. So why do we have a list of operators? Well, that allows us to combine different types of grade within one layer. So for example, if I start off with the base grade, I could use that to maybe increase the exposure and shift the white point to adjust the color balance a bit. And then I could use, say, the film grade to maybe increase the contrast of the midtones. And then the video grade, maybe use that to add a little gamma tweak. And then finally, say I could use the hue shift now to increase the saturation of the blue colors in the image. Note that I didn't use the curve grade. If you don't use an operator, then it's just simply ignored. So what we're seeing in the image display is the final result of all these operators. And as with the strips in the timeline, the operators are added top down. So in this case, first of all, the base grade is applied, then the film grade, then the video grade, and then the hue shift. So this is one way to build up a look using multiple operators inside one layer. However, I could do it a different way using a separate layer for each operator. So I'll show you how to do that. First of all, I'll just reset these operators. And you do that by selecting the operator and then pressing Command or Control on a Linux system and delete. And you'll see that the name has now gone white again. And I'll do the same for the video grade and the film grade. So now this layer just has the original adjustment in the base grade. Note that some Mac keyboards don't have a delete key. So to reset an operator, you have to use Shift, Command, and Backspace. Okay, so I'll build up that same grade, that same look, but using separate layers for each operator. So we'll add another layer by pressing P, and I'm not going to bother color coding all these layers. And in this layer, I'll select the film grade, and again, I'll apply that contrast to the midtones, that boost to the midtones. And then I'll add another layer by pressing P again, and this time I'll choose the video grade, and again I'll use that just to reduce the gamma. And then finally I'll add another layer, now we're at layer 4, and in that layer I'll use the hue shift again to increase the saturation of the blue colors. So the overall look is the same as we had before, but this time, rather than putting all of the operators in one layer, I've got 4 layers with one operator in each layer. And we call this collection of strips a stack. A stack is the input image layer with all the strips below it. So why would you choose to put each operator in a separate layer? Well, it depends on several things really. Firstly, you may want to check how your look is built up by viewing it as you progress through each of the different operators. And you can do that easily if each operator is in a separate layer by moving the row cursor up and down the grade layer strips. This blue line here, you can just see at the bottom of the timeline, is the row cursor, and it determines what you actually see on the image display. In this case, the row cursor is sitting at the bottom of the stack, so what we're seeing is the final result of all of the layers. But if I move it up the stack, which I can do using the up and down arrow keys on the keyboard, so if I move it up to the just below the top strip, for example, what we're seeing now is the original ungraded input image sequence. If I move it down a layer, we're now viewing layer 1, which is the base grade, and move it down another layer, we're now seeing the film grade added to that, then the video grade, and then finally the hue shift. So that's the final result. So it's quite easy to see the progression of our grade, of our look, just simply by moving the row cursor up and down the stack. And that wouldn't be so easy to do if all those operators were inside one layer. You'd have to bypass individual operators by coming in here and clicking on the B button. Incidentally, you can bypass a whole layer simply by pressing the B button right at the top here, or you can use the keyboard shortcut Command or Control and F11 on the keyboard. Or if you're working on a control panel, there's a dedicated layer bypass button. Okay, another reason for having operators in different layers will become apparent when we look at secondary grading. Now, I'm not going to cover secondary grades in detail in this session, but just to explain what I mean by that, a secondary grade is one which is isolated to specific parts of the image. For example, you may use a shape to restrict the area of the grade to just one part of the image, or you could use a keyer to apply the grade to, say, only a specific color range in the image. So I'll just give you a quick example to show you how this works. If I select layer 2, which is our mid-tone contrast boost layer, and I want to isolate that to just a specific part of the image, I can do that by adding a shape to that layer. So to add a shape, you simply press S on the keyboard, and now you can see that we have a shape strip in the stack, and the controls for the shape are now up here in the parameters view. And I'm going to choose an ellipse, and you can draw an ellipse quite easily just simply by clicking and dragging from the center out. And you can now see that that contrast boost is now only having an effect inside the ellipse. I'm going to soften the ellipse by increasing the feathering here. Now, it wouldn't be possible to do this if all the operators were in one layer, because the shape is being applied to all the operators inside, in this case inside layer 2. So it would have affected the whole look and not just the contrast boost. That's how matte operator strips work. They always apply to the strip below them in the stack. So if we actually want to see the shape, I can move the row cursor up the stack to the shape strip. And you can see that the shape itself is actually created as a black and white image. And that's how secondary grades work. Basically, we're creating a matte, which is then applied to the strip below. Anyway, as I said, we'll be covering secondary grading and also the individual grading operators in a lot more detail later in this course. Now, if you wanted to, you could, of course, combine operators inside a secondary layer, but remember that the matte will apply to all the operators that you have in this layer. Okay, I said I'd come back to the sequence strip. That's the top strip here in the stack. And I'm just going to explain a few of its parameters. So I'll click on the strip to select it. And now you can see all its parameters have appeared here in the parameters view. And one thing you'll notice is that the list of operators is different from the list of operators that we have in a grading layer strip. Firstly, the top operator is the sequence operator. And when that's selected, on the left-hand side here, you can see all the parameters related to the actual input image sequence itself. So right at the top here, for example, there's the file name, and this is the path to where the media actually currently exists on disk. Then we've got a section covering the input format, then there's color space, frame rate, and so on. I'm not going to cover these now. We'll look at those in detail in different parts of this training series. But one thing I will show you, because it's important that this is set correctly before you start grading, is the input color space setting. Now, if you remember from the last session, the input color space was set for each shot when it was added to the scene using Flux Manage. Now, in most cases, the source media itself contains metadata, which will automatically set the input color space. However, if the metadata is missing or incorrect, you may need to manually set that. Also, if you made a mistake when you added the shot for Flux Manage, you may need to correct it here. So you can do that easily just simply by clicking on the Input Color Space button and then choosing the correct color space from this list. Okay, back to the operators list. The next one is the audio operator, and that will show you the audio for this shot. Now, these EXR sequences don't have any audio, but if I switch over to another scene, these are all QuickTime movies, and these all have embedded audio in the movie. It's also possible to add audio to a shot from a separate file. For example, if you're working with dailies and you need to sync separate audio to each of the separate rushes files. Okay, the other operators in this layer, which incidentally, the top layer is always called layer 0. The other operators will depend on the type of media that you have. For example, this is EXR. These are EXR sequences. So they include a special EXR exposure operator, which allows us to make adjustments to the EXR exposure and gamma. If I was working with raw material, say ARRI raw, for example, this shot here, you'll see that we have an operator which allows us to adjust the ARRI raw decoder settings. Okay, I'll finish off by showing you how to add a different kind of operator to the stack. For example, if I want to apply a filter to the image. Now, there's two ways to do this, and I'll show you both of them. Firstly, I can simply use the Insert menu here. And you'll see that the operators are grouped into sections. For example, in the color section, we have most of the grading operators. What I want to add is a filter. Most filters are in the spatial section. So the filter I'm going to use in this case is called Boost Contrast. So I'll add it just by clicking on this button here. And you'll see that we now have another strip in our stack. And I can adjust because it's selected, I can adjust the control. And you'll see that what it's doing is it's adding a special kind of contrast boost. This is using an algorithm which uses a type of sharpening system to adjust the contrast according to detail in the image. So it gives quite a nice effect. But you'll notice that the filter has been added as a separate layer in the stack rather than being added inside a grading layer. And that means that I can't combine this operator with any other types of grade if I want to. So let me show you how to do that. So first I'll just remove the layer that I've added, the separate boost contrast layer, by holding down Shift and pressing P on the keyboard. Or if you're working on a control panel, you would hold down Shift and then press the layer button on the control panel. And now I'm going to add a layer back in again by pressing P. And again, you'll see we have another green grading layer. And as before, it's only got the grading operators inside it. But I can change any of these operators by right-clicking on it and then I can choose change operator type, and I get a list of most of the same operators that I had on the insert menu. So again, I'm going to choose the boost contrast operator, and that's now selected, so I can adjust the control here, and we get the same result. But now, because this is an operator inside a layer, I can add another operator to adjust it slightly. So for example, I could use the curve grade, maybe just to tweak it a little bit like that. And again, if I want to apply this just to part of the image, as before, I can add a shape to this layer. So let me do that. So I'll press S, and then again, I'll use an ellipse, and I just want to apply the effect just to the background area here. So I'm going to draw the ellipse and feather it out. And there we go. That's our final look. Now, before I finish, I'll just give you a quick summary of the keyboard shortcuts I've used for the layers. Remember, you can always get the keyboard shortcuts guide from the Help menu here. So that's been a quick look at the way Baselight builds up a grade stack out of layers containing operators. In a later tutorial, we'll have a closer look at the individual grading operators and some of the other filters and non-grading operators, such as transforms and effects plugins. Okay, so there was one question during that session, and that was regarding this waveform monitor here. This is actually a histogram, and it's similar to the kind of histogram you might find inside, say, the viewfinder of a camera. Basically, it's showing you the content, the relative content of the image itself. From the left-hand side, this is the darker parts of the image, to the right-hand side, which is the brighter parts of the image. And in this case, you can see that this particular image has a lot of, it's mainly dark. The background of the image is quite dark. Also, if I click on one of the areas of the image, you'll see that we actually get the relative, the actual color that we're clicking on in the histogram. So it's quite a useful way of seeing, if I move to another shot, for example, this one here, you can see that this one's much more evenly spread. There's quite a lot of brighter colors. And you can also see that we're superimposing the R, G and B channels on top of each other. So yeah, so that's the histogram. Okay, I've just had another question, not relating to this waveform display, but this one over here. And this is actually the transfer curve for this particular type of grade. So in the film grade itself, this is showing you how the grade will affect the colors. So this is effectively the input colors along the bottom, and these are the output colors. Now it's not showing us separate RGB, it's just showing us the relative intensity. But in this case, I made an adjustment to the midtones. In fact, as I move that up and down, you can see that that is in fact what it's doing. It's just varying the midtones within the actual image itself. Some of the other grade operators have different types of curves in them. The base grade, for example, includes a histogram as well as the transfer curve itself. Anyway, we're going to look at all the individual grading controls in a lot more detail in a future session. And somebody else has just asked how we would move a strip to a different endpoint. By that, I assume you mean moving a strip up and down, so we can change the order of strips in the stack. Again, we're going to cover the actual timeline and stacks in a lot more detail, but essentially a very quick way to do that is if you, let's say for example, I wanted to move the first layer, the base grade layer here. If I wanted to move it down to below the second layer, I can hold Alt on the keyboard and then press the down key a couple of times. And now you can see that I've moved it to below layer 1. So I've actually changed the order of the operators. In fact, if I now move the cursor up, the row cursor, you can see that the first layer is now in fact, layer 1 is now in fact the film grade, then followed by the base grade. Okay, well, I think we'll finish there today. If you do have any other questions or comments, as I said, feel free to send an email to student@filmlight.ltd.uk, or you can use the form in the training section on our website. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.